I don't know why I'd always pictured a great, grey, gloomy Victorian lump of a building. But the parsonage is a lovely house, early Georgian, well proportioned, with large windows and plenty of light.
Haworth is a small village on the edge of the Yorkshire Moors. The cobbled streets have changed very little since the Brontës came here at the beginning of the last century, and they were soon to become familiar with the steep climb to the parsonage. It was a bleak district, scarred by dark factories and mills. The Reverend Patrick Brontë arrived here in February 1820 with his young family and his wife Maria, already dying of cancer and having borne him 6 children in 7 years. Mrs. Gaskell describes the family on their arrival in her biography of Charlotte. Into the midst of this lawless yet not unkindly population, Mr. Brontë brought his wife and 6 little children. There are those yet alive who remember 7 heavily laden carts lumbering slowly up the long stone street, bearing the new parson's household goods to his future abode. One wonders how the bleak aspect of her new home, the low oblong stone parsonage high up, yet with a still higher background of sweeping moors, struck on the gentle, delicate wife, whose health even then was failing. The windows of Haworth Parsonage look over the graveyard at the front, but that was a hazard of Mr. Bronte's profession, and the graveyard hadn't then become the home of most of his family. It's not surprising that deathbeds and graves feature so largely in the Brontë novels. It was more than just Gothic morbidity for them, it was the reality under their windows. But if one looked out at the back, there was another view. A little track leads over the moors into nowhere, inviting, suggesting infinity. In many ways the situation would be paradise for children. There was the open country where they could walk without restraint for hours. Mrs. Gaskell tells how the girls would walk upward towards the purple-black moors. They seldom went downwards into Haworth. They were shy of meeting even familiar faces. They always preferred the solitude and freedom of the moors.
This house was acquired by the Brontë Society in 1928, and it's kept as much as possible as it used to be. The contents were all dispersed, but they're gradually being collected together again. But here, from the very first, there was tragedy. Mrs. Brontë died in 1821 and was replaced by her sister, Aunt Branwell. She was followed very shortly by the 2 eldest daughters, Elizabeth and Maria, who died of tuberculosis in 1825 after a disastrous stay at Cowan Bridge School, which Charlotte describes so horrifically in Jane Eyre. That left only 4 of them. Here, in a painting by Branwell, who aspired to be an artist, we see Charlotte, the eldest, then Emily, then Anne. Branwell painted himself out. Here in this house they spent most of their lives, making short and usually ill-fated excursions into the outside world, and here most of them died. They spent most of their time together in this room. One gets the impression that the house was crowded, perhaps because of all the intense emotion and activity that went on in here. The children were restless. The picture of them pacing around the dining room table of an evening while they created their imaginary worlds is to me like an image of souls trying to break out of their confines. There's something very strange about the idea of the 4 of them cooped up in here in the lamplight with all that immensity outside. There was no privacy in this house. All the children had to share bedrooms, and Mr. Bronte's study, where he would retire with his books of an evening, was only just over the corridor. They were on top of one another, isolated from the rest of the world. But they had compensations. They had books. They were allowed to read whatever they liked, and Charlotte had read Don Juan at an age when most girls weren't allowed even to look at Byron. No wonder most of her heroes are Byronic. And they had each other. It was the intensity of their childhood games that turned them into writers. They imagined whole countries and peopled them. they modelled them on the grand cities painted by John Martin, whose works hung in Mr. Brontës' study. It was a world of fantasy and of imagination. Even the objects that they produced were fantastic. Instead of making little dolls, they made little books, now immensely valuable and works of art in themselves. And they not only wrote, they painted. I prefer Charlotte's delicate sketches to Branwell's more ambitious oil paintings. And Emily and Anne could play the piano well. Were they happy here with all their talents, or did they feel confined and frustrated, as most people would feel cut off from all normal social life? It's impossible to tell. Charlotte wrote, "We wove a web in childhood, a web of sunny air. We dug a spring in infancy of water pure and fair. We sowed in youth a mustard seed and cut an almond rod. We are now grown up to riper age. Are they withered in the sod?" And that was their tragedy. They had to grow up, and they were all of them in their different ways completely unsuited to the outside world.
Branwell, who had such great aspirations as an artist, could not face reality, and all his efforts to escape from home ended in disaster. His drinking bouts were notorious, and eventually most of his time was spent in the Black Bull pub at the bottom of the churchyard. He lived in a world of drink and opium. Emily, of whom we know least of all because she has left us no record of herself, pined away when she was taken away from Haworth. She spent much of her time here in the kitchen with the servants, reading and kneading dough. She left home in all 3 times, once to school, once as a governess to Halifax, and once to Brussels with Charlotte. On each occasion she fell ill. She longed for her dogs and birds, for her freedom. Charlotte says, "My sister Emily loved the moors. Flowers brighter than the rose bloomed in the blackest of the heath for her. Out of a sullen hollow in the hillside, her mind could make an Eden. She found in the bleak solitude many and dear delights, and not the least and best loved was liberty. Liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. Without it she perished. At school every morning when she woke, the image of home and the moors rushed on her, and darkened and saddened the day that lay before her." What went on in her wild imaginings as she roamed around alone, we have only her novel Wuthering Heights and her poems to tell us.
Wuthering Heights is an amazing work, complex and sensitive, morbid and delicate. Emily's hero, Heathcliff, is an original creation. He owes a little to Byron, but his sadism and his violence are his own. Where did she get it all from? She got it from herself and from the landscape. The landscape here speaks of violence and of death. Another poet, Sylvia Plath, who was obsessed by death, walked on these moors, and she wrote a poem in which she said that she was afraid to pay the roots of the heather too much attention, for fear that they would invite her to whiten her bones amongst them. It's like that up here. Emily's world was a world of sudden death, storms, savage dogs, shotguns, and morbid psychology. Of course, there were some lighter moments. There was the bluebell trembling in its earthly shelter. There was Cathy with Hareton sticking primroses into her porridge. There were June days when you could lie on the moors and gaze up at the blue sky where the larks were singing. Emily was tough, and Wuthering Heights is a novel of desolation and solitude. But even she had her weaker moments. She wrote a poem in which she said, "I am the only being whose doom no tongue would ask, no eye would mourn.
I never caused a thought of gloom, a smile of joy, since I was born. In secret pleasures, secret tears, my changeful life has slipped away, as friendless after 18 years, as lone as on my natal day.
This was Charlotte's room. Of all the Brontës, her life seems to me to be the most noble and the most pathetic. She had to look after her brother and sisters from a ridiculously early age. She worked hard as a teacher to support them, though she didn't like teaching and didn't like children. She worked hard as a novelist in circumstances so sad that they would have silenced most people forever. And she wasn't strong. Her eyesight wasn't good. She had to use an eyeglass. And she was so small, only 4'9", that the sight of her gown and the sight of her boot is infinitely touching. How could she walk the moors when the winds blew? She, of all of them, needed desperately to escape. To her, Haworth was a prison. Not, it's true, when she was young, when she was happy in her closeness to Branwell and in her fantasies about a brilliant future. But the fantasies came to nothing. She saw Branwell destroy himself before her eyes with drink and opium, and she nursed him through his last illness, seeing things that Victorian parsons' daughters weren't supposed to know about. She herself craved for action and a fuller life. The moors in her novels don't represent freedom. Freedom to her was society and large cities and change and sex. Charlotte had a passionately sexual nature, as readers of her novels quickly found out. No wonder Jane Eyre was considered so shocking, and no wonder it sold so well. She nearly managed to escape. She organised herself to go to Brussels to learn French. She actually saw the city and the architecture of her dreams. This is the trunk that she had in Brussels. It's like the one that her heroine in Villette loses on that long and lonely journey. Charlotte writes, "And my portmanteau with my few clothes and the remnants of my £15 enclosed in my pocket-book, where was that? I had tied on a green ribbon that I might know it at a glance." And so off she went to Brussels to cope with the big Belgian girls and to fall in love with her professor, Monsieur Heger. And then she was summoned home again by family troubles, and back she came to eat her heart out in silence, waiting for letters that never came. It was after her return from Brussels, she went twice, once with Emily and once alone, that the three girls sat down and wrote their first novels. It would be hard to find a clearer example of sublimation in literature. They sat and wrote here, Anne and Charlotte about their trials as governesses, and Emily about the violence of man and nature. Anne and Emily's novels were accepted, but Charlotte had the additional frustration of finding hers refused. But undismayed, with her usual perseverance, she sat down and wrote another. This one was Jane Eyre. It was accepted, it was published, it was an instant success. At this point, a whole new world could have opened up for the Brontës. They'd achieved recognition. Thackeray admired Jane Eyre immensely, and Charlotte dedicated the second edition to him, which was a mistake in view of the fact that Thackeray, like Rochester, had a mad wife, and rumours began to circulate that Charlotte was Thackeray's mistress. Anne and Charlotte went to London to see their publishers. They could have embarked on a literary social life. They even had some money coming in from the books. But it was too late. The damp of the parsonage and the cold had ruined their health, and their brother Branwell died in September 1848 in his room upstairs. All his hopes had come to nothing, and he'd spent the last few months of his life borrowing money from the sexton to spend on drink. Emily followed him in December. She died here on this couch, refusing to see a doctor, refusing to admit pain and defeat, refusing to allow her sisters to help her. Her dog, Keeper, followed the coffin through the garden and into the church, and he howled for days outside her bedroom door. It was the bitterness of the winter that destroyed them. Charlotte writes pathetically to a friend, "No need to tremble now for the hard frost and the keen wind. Emily does not feel them. She died in a time of promise. We saw her taken from life in its prime." Anne died the following spring, quietly in a boarding house in Scarborough, gazing at the sea. She was buried there to spare her father the agony of burying the third of his children within 9 months. And so Charlotte, the frailest looking of the three, was left alone with her ageing father. She was writing Shirley, a book which is in part a tribute to Emily and in part a bitter complaint about the lives of old maids in 19th century England. It must have been a terrible time for her, cooped up with Mr. Brontë, bereft of almost all the human company she'd ever known. There was nothing to do but work. Invitations reached her from the outside world, for she was now famous. Despite some excursions, she remained here, writing, anxious about her own health. She enjoyed going to see Mrs. Gaskell in her lively home in Manchester, but she was too timid for London. It was a torment to her to meet new people. She writes to her publisher that she is alone, with her youth gone, sisters lost, a resident in a moorland parish where there is not a single educated family. For society, seclusion has in great measure unfitted me, and I doubt if I might enjoy it if I could. The prisoner in solitary confinement, the toad in the block of marble, all in time shape themselves to their lot. From this situation, she wrote Villette, perhaps the greatest novel about loneliness ever written. But she wasn't destined to die in utter loneliness. Perhaps writing Villette frightened her, for she didn't write another book. She engaged herself to her father's one-time curate, Mr. Nichols. Mr. Brontë was furious, Mr. Nichols was madly in love, and Charlotte was resigned. In one of her most depressing letters, she writes to a friend, "I am still very calm, very expectant. The happiness I taste is of the soberest order. Providence has offered me this destiny. Doubtless then it is the best for me." She was married in Haworth Church in 1854, and the honeymoon was spent in Ireland. Whether she was happy or unhappy, we can't tell, for less than a year later she died here in this room. It was probably pregnancy that killed her. She died prematurely at the age of 39, but she'd struggled on longer than the rest of her family, and she'd written more books than they had. But perhaps she hadn't got so many more books to write. The materials round here aren't inexhaustible. Emily had written one masterpiece, Anne 2 books, and Charlotte 4, 2 of them using the same subject matter. They didn't feed upon the outside world. They fed upon themselves, and they wore themselves away. It may be difficult, as Emily says, to imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in the quiet earth, but one has to look at this place with a certain amount of awe and terror when one thinks of the suffering that was endured here. It may be lucky for us that they were as they were, but what would they have chosen?
Lucy Worsley is back on the detective trail, investigating 4 dramatic chapters and iconic characters in British history, from the Gunpowder Plot to Bloody Mary, Jack the Ripper and William the Conqueror, in her new series on BBC iPlayer.